Access all areas, I guess, is where your career started off, and the ability to be able to talk to these guys and photograph them on almost a kind of very serendipitous in a way. How did you feel about it at the time? Did you feel that you were on a little bit of a trajectory and things that, because these bands were at very early stages, some of them, did you feel that you were going to take off and this was going to be it?
God, I think I felt nearly as sure of myself. It's only with hindsight that maybe one can look at those things. But what is quite odd is that, which you can only sort of see in retrospect again, is that my father, I come from Zimbabwe. I was brought up in a small town in Zimbabwe. My parents were professionals. My father was an architect, and my father's hobby was photography. And also, before us kids came along, he used to play guitar in a big band. Yeah,
right.
I never saw him playing guitar in a big band, but I think he said to me he had something like a Fender or a Gibson guitar that probably would have been worth more than everything, a 60s version. Anyway, and I've got a picture of him in my book, The Moment, of him actually playing. So in a strange way, my profession is his hobbies, photography, which he did very, very well. He was a really good photographer with a darkroom at home, and music. Yeah. So that's a bit peculiar in its own sort of way. Yeah. So I can't say that I had a trajectory or that when I, fell in love with the Beatles that I ever really thought that I'd work with them. But I think that if you're very focused and on things that you really like, and you somehow have an urge to do that for the rest of your life, then there's these little, like I call them, little crumbs that come along to sort of point you in a direction. Timing.
Yes, and you were learning on the job, I guess, as well.
Well, I certainly had to learn, because I've only ever done a 2-week course in photography.
Yes.
But I found actually quite a lot of the good photographers in Rockarchive also were untrained, more or less.
Yeah.
And most of the musicians, remember, rock musicians, are totally untrained.
How did you get on with them? What sort of relationship did you have with them early doors?
What, the musicians?
Yeah.
The first ones, like the Pink Floyds and the Led Zeppelins and not the Stones really, but Mick Jagger, I suppose I had a little bit of dealings with. I'm trying to think of all those bands that played at the Rainbow, B.B. King, Eric Clapton, Pete Townsend, The Who. I had no relationship with them whatsoever, except that I had access to the backstage area as well as to the pit because I was the photographer there.
Were you listening to their music prior to that?
Well, I was certainly a Floyd fan because I went to the Roundhouse and sat cross-legged and listened to Pink Floyd doing, I guess it would have been Echoes or something around that period of time.
Yeah.
In 1971, I was not a photographer.
Yeah.
I was 16 or something, 16, 17, and I went to gigs. Yeah. I really liked that kind of music. I also really liked reggae music too, but it didn't seem to be Jimmy Cliff or a couple of them reggae people used to come through occasionally. Yeah. But I do remember actually vividly somewhere around 1970-71 going to a Led Zeppelin show and being at the front. I think it was a sitting gig. That's how I remember it. Anyway, I remember sitting. And I was within I was on the edge of an area that was clearly for either the press or their families. And it's like a caged-in front of stage area. Yeah. And I was on the edge of it. And I thought, how do I get in that cage? How do I get closer? And at the time, I hadn't gone to art school yet. I'd done a course in shorthand and typing. And I thought I was doing Pitman shorthand in a notebook. And I thought, I wonder if they'll think I'm a journalist if I do a bit of Pitman shorthand in this. I was looking for a way in. Yeah. I was looking for a way to have tea with the Beatles in Abbey Road. Yeah. I wrote a letter to Abbey Road and I said, I'm at school and I really want to go and see, and they wrote a nice letter back saying, sorry, you can't. I was looking for something to get me a bit closer to it. But as to why, I'm not too sure. So maybe I was on the lookout unconsciously for
Yeah, and I guess if you were listening to the music as well, because if you photograph bands, you kind of have to know their songs sometimes.
Yes.
You know when they're leaning back off mic and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
I mean, was that happening subconscious in your head when you were shooting, or were you? How did you approach a shoot?
Well, I would say that actually I had a very poor record collection, and that I was not actually that. When I think of all the rock journalists and their vast collections and their knowledge and I haven't a clue. You know, honestly, I other than a few albums and a few bands, I didn't really. But as I also mentioned, I think to Eamon on one of his questions, which was a very astute question, which was, I did that photography course, the 2-week course that I'm talking about, and I was hooked on the very first roll of film. Yeah. I was so ready for it. And I had a couple of bullseyes. You know, the next day at college, it was like, that's a great shot of that. That's another really great shot, and they were mine. And I was like, this is for me.
Yes.
So whilst I hadn't planned anything, and going in the darkroom, I already knew the magic of that from watching my dad. I hadn't even gone in the darkroom yet.
Yeah.
And I wasn't afraid to be in pitch black loading up the carousels, which some students didn't like being in the pitch, but I had no problem with that at all.
So you had an empathy for the art form and for the music in a way because of your dad.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it all came together in a sort of an opportunity a week later. And that's what I'm saying. It's all rather strange. It is rather strange. And it's carried on being strange for the last 45 years or something from time to time.
What do you do? What do you shoot when you don't shoot rock bands?
I've been shooting constantly for the last few years with this Olympus thing, and before that I used to carry a Leica around. So I am shooting actually a lot, and don't look at it very much, which is quite odd as well. So. If you say what are you shooting, it's split into different categories. There's rock, there's rock not rock, there's rock, there's not rock, and in not rock is all my attempts at doing stuff that was outside of rock, which includes, I think I mentioned the Orange Order of Northern Ireland, which is a project set to me by a magazine. I didn't know what the Orange Order was at the time at all. That project. Visit to Peru, where I won an award for landscape photography. I do a little bit of landscapey stuff and flowers and that sort of thing, just because it's quite nice. I do pictures of my daughter when she was little. I do pictures of friends and events that are around friends. And then again on the professional side, in the 80s, when I moved away from rock a bit, I worked on films, doing stills for films, quite big films, quite a few, and also portraits of people like Robert De Niro for Time Out, Nelson Mandela. I did a piece on the ANC.
Right.
My picture of Nelson Mandela was used by the embassy when he was made president. A whole bunch of sort of...
What was it like shooting De Niro?
Well, it was funny shoot with him, because actually I was completely unfazed by him, not being a film buff at all.
Right.
And the journalist was beside himself. It was like meeting God for him. And for me, it was just, well, all right. And then I sat in on as one did, you sat in while the journalist was, and you took your snaps.
Yes.
But I had to do a cover. So you've got a PR going, okay, you've got 10 minutes at the end of this, and where do you want him? And I'm like, okay. And I set up a light and on the roof, and I had 10 minutes, and and he came out, and he was awful. He was sort of giggling, and then, but not in a way that was. It was well, I can't. And putting his hand, and I was going, and I remember thinking, and the PRs behind me going, right, that's 5 minutes you've got, and I've got to get a cover for Time Out. And I went up to him and I said, I went right up to him because he was like where you are, and I had my camera here, and I went right, and I said, now listen here, Robert. I said, I'm trying to do my job. I'm trying to get a decent picture of you for the cover. So you just give me your attention. I can't remember the exact words. And I went back to the camera and I shot it. And he is full on. And that was the shot. That was the cover. But I'd been dealing with rock bands, you see. So, an actor sort of being silly wasn't going to faze me too much.
Yes, actors can be very silly.
Yeah, actors can be very,
Very
silly.
silly.
I'd worked on films a bit as well.
Yeah. What films did you work on?
Well, I worked with Christopher Hampton, the writer Christopher Hampton, who wrote a lot of film scripts like Dangerous Liaisons and so on, and he did. And for some
beautiful stuff.
Beautiful stuff. Yeah, beautiful. I worked on, for example, the film Carrington with Carrington had Emma Thompson playing the lead, and some other very big actors that became well known in or are. And then I worked on Secret Agent with Robin Williams, Gerard Depardieu, Bob Hoskins. Quite a lot of others that I can't sort of reel off at this moment, and then also writers like Harold Pinter, Colin Thubron, Dervla Murphy, sort of writers that I admired and stuff. And some very interesting fashion stuff. John Galliano, for example.
Right. Okay. Wow.
Because when I worked for The Face, suddenly it was all right, rock and fashion, and I'm like, okay, I'll do fashion, but I know nothing about clothing, and I did a bit of advertising work.
Right,
Now that was very interesting, the advertising, because and fashion as well, because I was used to chatting to the subject that you're photographing, but in the advertising, I remember I had to do a lingerie ad,
right,
for sort of and an art director came with a drawing. You know, I'm not used to that either. This is when I had my studio and I was trying to sort of, but the money was so good. And the drawing was a girl lying on her back in a boat, trailing her hand in the water with sort of, lotus flowers and what have you, wearing the lingerie. And so she was lying, and in the picture that he'd drawn, her breasts were standing up. And I said to him, this art director, I said, when women lie down, the breasts are not going to be in that position. So he said, well, we'll have to raise the boat then. So we had to build in the studio boat that was tilted like this, but from the camera angle, it looked like she was. So that was the first one. And then I said, I've got this girl who'd be really good. She was one of my students. Is she 34B bust? I said, I don't know. I said, but she's got a nice body in it. How tall is she? And I said, she's quite small. He said, no, she's got to be a blonde and about 5'8", that kind of thing. Yeah. So then I had to interview girls for the lingerie, and queues of these girls from the model agency were all down the staircase, and I'd be talking to them for too long. I'd go, oh, nice to meet you, and next. So this is one of my experiences of trying to go outside of my music industry into other areas and learning a lot about photography.
Yes, and learning a lot about people, I guess.
And learning a lot about people, and in fashion, I learned pretty quick. I had I took pictures of models. I had no interest in clothes, but you don't have to. I was thinking, well, what does David Bailey know about clothes? He knows about girls. I thought, okay, I don't need to know about clothes. And there were all these gay stylists around, and they did all of that. So I did some quite good shots. And then I went to see the magazines like Cosmopolitan. I didn't go to Vogue or anything. I just went to the women's magazines. And then I realised I didn't stand a chance, because the fashion editors were women, the hairdressers were gay, the girls were girls, and they wanted a bloke. They wanted a nice, macho fashion photographer to, address the balance. And it wasn't really until Corinne Day came along and did Kate Moss and things, and Nick Logan from The Face brought her in, that actually things started to change and women became involved in fashion. At that point, when I was trying to see if I could get in, it was very much male photographers.
Yes. I guess, and in the rock world as well, did you have to develop sharp elbows, Jill?
I was certainly elbowed. I don't know about my being sharp elbowed myself. Funny enough, I've although I kind of have suffered from lack of confidence a great deal. That is, thinking that I'm not very good, or I don't know what I'm doing a great deal, or not good enough. I've never felt competitive or upset if other people do what I consider even better shots of the band than me. I'm thinking here of Oasis, for example, that they became my group, Now, they became my group because the other photographer who'd been working with them had got into trouble by publishing a picture of Liam and some girl that he shouldn't have done.
Yeah.
So I knew this photographer, and he's a nice guy. So they brought me in. I had nothing to do with it. They brought me in, and he was furious, and he accused me of stealing his group, you see, which does happen,
Yeah.
So anyway, so I worked with Oasis, but over the period of time, sometimes they wanted to work with other people, and I always said, definitely do it. Because first of all, I've got my set of skills, but somebody else might give you a totally different look.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind, just as long as you if I want to shoot some pictures, that you accommodate me if you don't mind, because I'm, documenting. And to this day, I get texts from Noel Gallagher saying to me, I'm playing with Paul Weller, are you coming down? Or and I'm like, oh, yeah, all right, I'll be there. Yeah. Because of that, I think, because of my lack of... And also I work in Rockarchive with 50 photographers.
Yes.
And I'm a huge fan of their work, of rock photography in general. I find them fascinating. Yeah. I like their stories. Yeah. I interview them like you're interviewing me. I ask them questions. I want to know the answers. I get very jealous when they go, oh, yeah, me and Bob Dylan, we did that. I'm like, oh, blast, lucky you. But not jealous in as,
Did you come to Bob Dylan... you said you come to Bob Dylan late. Did you come to his music late, or did you come to Bob Dylan late?
Well, both. Although actually I came to Bob Dylan sooner. It was the music. I just didn't like all that blowing in the wind stuff, and I didn't like all that. I thought the music that he wrote was really great, but preferably sung by somebody else or played by Jimi Hendrix or,
Yeah.
I didn't like that whiny kind of voice very much.
Okay.
Whilst admiring him, obviously.
Yes.
And also, I was never commissioned to work with Dylan. Because I worked on commissioned work mainly, because do you want to go on the road with so-and-so? And you go, yes, me. And sometimes you got the job and sometimes you didn't.
Do you still own your... Well, obviously you must still own your archive. When you were working for Melody Maker and all these other people, they didn't sort of acquiesce or say they owned your material when you were doing commission?
Thank God, no. I mean, we were very badly paid.
Yes.
But thank goodness we owned the copyright.
Yeah.
And I mean, the journalists are very jealous of that now because, we make a living from our archives and they don't really.
Yeah.
Although there is a website called Rock's Back Pages that does a bit of it.
Why do you reckon bands don't want... Yeah, I mean, 3 songs and out. Why do you think they do that? What's the reasoning behind that? Do you sort of...
No, I completely understand it in a way because... Well, Gilmour summed it up really in my book, The Moment, actually. He said it's one thing to see 1 or 2 friendly faces that down there shooting away. Yeah. It's quite another to have 150 of them, which is at Glastonbury, it's more like 450 sometimes. 200 certainly at Glastonbury. It's a crowd all snapping away. I mean, I think that must be hugely intrusive.
Yes.
And so I completely understood it. But having said that... here's somebody who ruined my pictures. I photographed Bowie at the Rainbow in 1973 during his Ziggy Stardust period because he was playing there. And I had that rainbow pass that said access all areas. And a bodyguard jumped off the stage, or a security man, which they didn't really have in those days, came up to me and said, "You're not allowed to photograph David Bowie." I said, "I am. Here's my pass." During the gig. He said, "No, you're not. We've got our own photographer." Opened the camera and pulled the film out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was heavy stuff. And afterwards I went backstage and the manager was there, but sort of blonde on each arm. He had a very unpleasant manager at that time of his... And I said, "Your bodyguard did this to me." And he said, "Oh, have this champagne," like as if it was some sort of compensation. Yeah. And I later found out that was Mick Rock, the photographer, who was guarding his own territory, see? He said, "Well, I thought to myself, actually, I think I'll hang on to this one and I'll be your photographer and you don't need anybody else. And, that'll protect the..." So that was the opposite of how I was. Yeah. I don't think I've answered your question there, I think.
No.
You asked me something completely different. It just came to my head.
We go wandering off. The Bob Dylan sort of saga then is an interesting one. There's a story about Bob Dylan arriving at somebody's house.
Yes. Dave's house.
That is such an amazing story.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a bit about Bob because just because it shows a little bit my personality, and also because it was such a great story. So with Dylan, I didn't have an interest during the 60s, but I photographed him with Dave Stewart, the said Dave,
Yes.
in 1985, actually.
Right.
So kind of that sort of new romantic era almost. And Fergal Sharkey.
Oh, yes.
Fergal Sharkey from the Undertones was doing a launch. And I don't know if David produced his album, but he was doing a sort of a showcase gig to which I was invited. And Dylan was sitting there with Dave Stewart.
Right.
And I thought, oh, great. Dylan. I had no interest in the music at this point, by the way. I'd only seen him once and thought he wasn't very good. And Dave was, I said to them, I went up to them and I said, can I, in fact, Dave introduced me because I knew Dave. And this very, very limp handshake, sort of like, ooh. And I said, can I take a picture? And Dylan goes, yeah, one. Right? So I better get this right. I had a flash on the camera.
Yeah.
I stood back and I was thinking, and I pointed and he turned his head sideways to face Dave, so it was like him looking at Dave, and I shot the one picture and that was it. That was like I was dismissed. So that was my only dealings with him until Time Out of Mind came out in 1998,
Yeah.
And I fell in love with that record.
Yeah.
Just loved it. Echoed my life at the time. There was something about it and I just loved it. Mm-hmm. And I just done that big Oasis exhibition, and I'd done 4 years with Oasis and was ready to do something else. And like Zed, looking for a project kind of thing, I thought, Bob Dylan, clearly, his music has called me now, so I must go to him. And I really did feel a calling, actually. I really did. I felt magnetised towards Bob Dylan. Had no idea how his setup worked, but in the past I thought it couldn't be that different to other people's. So I wrote to his manager because he was due to come to the UK on his endless tour.
Yes.
He was playing at Glastonbury, 98, and he was playing at Wembley, and I think he was even playing somewhere else. But anyway, so I bought a couple of tickets for Wembley, and then I thought, but I'll go to Glastonbury because I have good access at Glastonbury. They're always very nice to me there. And he was playing on the Sunday, and that Glastonbury wasn't as bad as this last one, but it was almost as bad. It was a washout.
Yeah.
It was appalling. It was a disaster area. It was awful. And I'd been there actually at Glastonbury on the Friday, and I thought, I can't stand it. I'm coming home. I'll go and see Bob Dylan at Wembley on the Saturday. That's right. And something happened with the tickets. I can't remember exactly what happened, but as a result of whatever happened, I couldn't go and see him I would have just been in the crowd. I couldn't go to Wembley. I thought, well, I'll have to go back to Glastonbury. I thought, you're out of... I was talking to myself. I was thinking, you're mad. It's raining. You've already been there. You've seen how awful it is. And it's rained all the time. There was a gale blowing that night. And I thought, you're out of your mind. But I still went. Okay. And in wellies and everything. I arrived at the station. The taxi said, well, I can't get you on the site. I'll take you as far as Pill, I think it was, which is on the outskirts. And then I walked through the mud with my bags and my wellies, and everybody was coming the other way trying to get out, and I was going in. It was apocalyptic. It was biblical. I felt like people were... a few kind people gave me like a cup of tea on the way in. It took me about 45 minutes or an hour to get into the site. And then I had press pass. I went into the backstage area, and they said to me, oh, Bob Dylan's bus has got stuck. Michael Eavis has gone to fetch him, in his Land Rover, because it was a disaster. And I went to see John Peel, who was a friend of mine, and Jules Holland, who's also a friend of mine. They were in the BBC area, which was bordering on the dressing room area, which were porter cabins at the time. So I was standing there, and blow me down, but the bloke, and I didn't have any passes other than this media pass, blow me down, but the bloke on the gate of the dressing room area was an Oasis security man. He's going, oh, you're here, that's great, are you coming in? I went, well, I haven't got any passes. Oh, no, come in. So I came in just as Bob Dylan was arriving, actually, rescued by Michael Eavis, and I had a copy of my book, The Moment, on me, because I felt as though I was going to make contact with him This was entirely instinctive, really. When I got into that backstage area, there was a lady there who is, to this day, 40 years later or 30 years later, never forgiven me. She said to me, "You're not allowed in this backstage area to take pictures. Put your cameras away. There's no photography for Bob Dylan." So, okay, no problem. I'll put my cameras away in a secure place in that area. But I had the book the moment, right? So then I'm standing talking to this security bloke, and Dylan comes by and is going to his dressing room, which was a porter cabin. And as he walked past me, I went up to him and said, "I'd like to give you a copy of my book." "Oh, thank you very much," he said, and he was quite gracious, and he went off to his porter cabin. I was thinking, oh, that's good, done that now. About 10 minutes later, he came to talk to me.
Wow.
And that's how the Bob quest began. And we had a whole chat. And
what did you talk about?
Well, he said to me, "Oh, a photography book, that's great." He said, "I could use a good photographer." And I said, "Oh, yes, you could," because I'd seen the cover of Time Out of Mind, which was a blurred picture, and I thought I could do better than that at least. And also, he asked me to take him for a walk around the site. I said to him, "Well, I don't think that's a good idea, Bob. I mean, look, I was covered in mud, and I said, I wouldn't advise it. I said, it's really bad out there." And all that. It was that kind of a conversation. He said to me, "Did you write me a letter?" Now, this I've never quite understood. I thought, my God, did that manager pass the letter on to him? Right. But I don't know if that was the case or not. But I subsequently became very friendly with this manager, and he was the sort of manager who might well pass on a letter. And I think my letter said something like, "I've never been a fan of yours, but I really like Time Out of Mind." And apparently he likes that too.
Wow.
So anyway, I don't know if he got it or not, but the long and short of it is I said to him, "Yes, you could use a good photographer." And he said, "Well, do you want to take some pictures?" So I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, on the stage?" I said, "Yes, please." I said, "But you better tell all these security people, because otherwise I'll be like a cannonball. I'll be flung out in a second." I said, "Okay." So he went and told somebody. It was his personal, and so then I went to the backstage to retrieve my cameras from this woman who's never forgiven me. And she said to me, "You can't have your cameras back." I said, "I can." She said, "No, you can't. There's no photographs of Bob Dylan." And I said, "He just said, ask me to photograph it." And she was like, "No, he didn't." And then this bloke came and he said, "Yes, he did." And she handed the cameras to me and she said, "But you're not even supposed to be here. You haven't got a backstage access or anything. You're an intruder in here." I said, well, sometimes it's like that. What can you say?
Yeah.
And then I did follow him. There's a shot I regret not taking. He was standing in the doorway of the porter cabin in his wellies, looking out, which I thought was brilliant. But I thought, no, don't shoot just yet, Jill. Just wait. Don't shoot that. Well, I should have shot it because I never got another chance to shoot that again. But I went on stage with him. And then his own people couldn't believe it, that he'd invited me to do so. So I didn't find that peculiar, but I didn't realise then that he was very strange about those things. And
obviously your book had an impact on him then.
I don't know. In retrospect, I think I had an impact on him, because I think he picks up women on these, this is, but only in retrospect.
Right.
I think probably I was a bit more nubile then than I am now, and he probably thought I was quite cute, actually.
Really?
Well, I think that might have been part of it anyway.
Yeah.
But subsequent to that, I took these, and he said to me, if you take pictures, can I see them? You're not going to just pop. I said, yeah, I'll send them to your office, which I did. And his manager was delighted, because he said, well, actually, he doesn't usually allow pictures.
Yeah. Ray Davis, I'll tell you a little story, one of my stories. I do a Larne Literary Festival, and I'm their official photographer, and all these lovely people arrive, and Ray Davis arrived, and I knew he didn't like having his photograph taken. And I said, "Mr. Davis, I'd really like to do a portrait." I set up a little studio, and I'd really like to do a portrait of you. And he said, and I said, "Oh, fair enough." And he came up to me, he held both my hands, and he said, "Thank you very much." I thought, shame, but there we are. And I was in the green room, and lots of people are coming and going. And he suddenly turned to me and he said, "You remind me of a good friend of mine, Thomas Johansson." And I thought, right, okay, yeah. And he didn't say anything else. And then about 5 minutes later, he turned to me, "You can take a photograph of me now." And he went and he sat in the seat, and I took 6 shots of him, and they were absolutely delightful.
Oh, wow.
And
you should put one in Rockarchive, actually. It'd be nice
it's
to have.
it's an absolute beaut.
Put one in Rockarchive.
I
I'm
would
delighted
love
to have
to.
that because I don't think we've got a nice portrait of Ray Davies. And he's
He
one of the
insisted
greats.
on doing this.
Yeah, yeah.
But that was fine, you know, and it was. I don't know. I love shooting bands, but shooting bands is really quite hard. I find it's, and I'm getting on a bit. So, and I find it. But I enjoy the process. There's a. You kind of feel that you're part of the act somehow.
Mm.
Did you feel that?
Yeah, and also I consider it as like a meditation, actually.
Yeah.
Shooting bands, I still like it. I think maybe the best of all, because I like them doing. You go and get on the stage and do your thing, and I'll do mine. Just don't bother me. If you let me get on with it, I'll do a really good job for you. And then I go into some sort of zone. I don't even hear the music really.
Yeah.
Hardly hear it. You're just in a zone, and it's just the most wonderful kind of thing. I really like. I still really love to.
You were shooting a lot of British bands.
Mm.
Did the opportunity ever arise to shoot a lot of people in America, or did that ever happen? Sort of people wanting you to shoot there? Or?
Yeah, I mean, you got to do quite a bit of travelling when you worked for the music press. You didn't get to see much, but you did quite a bit of travelling, and you'd vie for those jobs because, well, there would be a chance to actually get much better material when you're all away together and you got the Marmite out and and all that sort of thing. So I did travel quite a bit, and including in the States, and worked with quite a few American bands, like Blondie, I suppose, and I'm trying to think of the bands that I worked with in the States. I certainly travelled there a great deal, sort of including early rap music like Africa Bambaataa and all that stuff.
How did you find that scene when it first kicked off?
I didn't understand it at all, actually.
Yeah.
But it seemed to be this hip-hop stuff that was going on first in America. It seemed to start from the Puerto Rican community of New York, from what I could see. Yeah. And I just happened to be there, and it was really quite early. I mean, I think it was, sort of late 70s, early 80s when it was starting, actually, when I think about it now. But African Bambaataa 84, I think I photographed him. And they were all playing these clubs, and they were on the decks and everything. I was thinking, where's the live music? And even with Wham, actually, and George Michael. Right. Wham, they haven't got any musicians playing with them. They're playing in these discos and they're singing to backing tracks with dancers. And I thought, well, what's that all about? I found it extraordinary. Yeah, yeah. And as for rapping, I mean, my daughter's 50 Cent and all, and I thought Eminem was pretty good, but I've never and Beyonce, my little picture I showed of those girls from the hood, it was a real attempt to sort of unglamorize that whole world, which seems a bit...
If you had, that sounds like a cheesy question, and it is a cheesy question, if you wanted to shoot anybody who's on the scene now, who would you really like to get your teeth into as a photographer?
Oh, I don't know, really. I mean, I'd actually quite like to do Adele. I went to Glastonbury to do Adele this time, but there was no photographers allowed. And that very woman who stopped me with Bob?
No, she was there.
She's always there. Everybody at Glastonbury's been there forever. Michael Eavis's staff go back about 40 years. Can you believe it? She thwarted me this time as well. Right. She didn't thwart me for Dylan because I got through that one, but actually every year I try to get them to give me an all access. Yeah. And this year, for some reason, I didn't get it together, and I had last year's pass, which looks the same as, if to most security they can't tell. Yeah. But her job is to stop people going into the dressing room areas, and especially from photographing them. And this year, she happened to see me just when Adele was... I was going to go and speak to Adele's manager, who I know through various... I was going to say to Adele's manager, look, come on, let me do... and she said to me, where's your pass? Now I thought, I'm not pulling out the one from last year because I'll be out on my ear and she might take it off me and then I'll have to go to all the awful toilets that are not in the backstage area. I'm not going to give her that. So I said, I haven't got the one that you probably looking for this year. And she said to me, well, what are you doing? Back to that, what are you doing here? I said, well, madness brought me in, which they certainly did. Yeah. She said, well, you'll have to leave. So I was out.
Do you know her name?
But she's got a daughter now who's, equally... Anyway, I mean, this is what I'm saying.
It's a
family thing at Glastonbury. Yeah. So you can see that actually there's a part of me that kind of... I slightly gets off on this kind of conflicting situation because it brings out a sort of punky, Keith Richardsy, thing in me.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I'm slightly addicted to that as well. It's probably not a very good thing at my age. In fact, at one point with Bob Dylan, on the Bob Quest, I was in the wrong place. So I shouldn't have been there. And his manager had become a friend of mine. He said to me, now, Jill, I know you were at that sound check because the security spotted you there. He said, and they had to throw you out. He said, that's not very dignified for a woman of the year, 19, whatever it was, and a woman of your age. And I said, you know what, you're right. I'm not going to do it anymore. Not to Bob Dylan, anyway.
Big groups, big stages, big lighting, big. Have you ever been tempted to do the kind of really intimate stuff, little jazz clubs and all that sort of stuff? Because I loved some of your jazz work.
Thank you, yeah. In a way, not really, because that kind of music, strangely enough, isn't my favourite kind of music. Okay. Having said that, Jeff Buckley,
yes,
in that little club,
fabulous, yeah.
That it's not the size of the venue that puts me off particularly, but I sort of feel maybe even that the jazz era, just like the rock and roll era, kind of had its moment. I caught the end of it, the end of Miles Davis's career, the end of Duke Ellington's career. I know that people still do jazz, but people also still do impressionist paintings, but they're not Monet or Manet. No. And I think that it didn't catch my imagination, perhaps, the jazz field. Although actually to photograph it is very nice. Yeah. But it doesn't sort of... Charlie Watts, of course, is the other way.
Yeah, because he still does jazz.
He absolutely still does. And then people like Dr. John, who on the cusp are also nice. I like that music very much too. So no, I haven't really.
And I was really glad you had a picture of Captain Beefheart.
Oh, lovely!
Wow, what? Because I had the Trout Mask replica album, which was one of my. Everybody thought I was mad listening to that stuff, but he was something else.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And Anton Corbijn did fantastic images of him when he went to live in the desert.
Right. Oh, right. Yeah.
Oh, it's wonderful. Yeah.
Oh, and I'm sounding thing now, but the Leonard Cohen shot as well, because Leonard Cohen is one of my favourites.
Me too. And I think Leonard Cohen, his current stuff is fantastic. He's one of those artists that's really gone. And I think some of Paul Simon is also really great that he's doing now. Yeah. There are some that are still, they've taken it all the way through. Neil Young is another one. Yes. Not all of it, but there's still great stuff coming out of those people. Yes. So, yeah. And there's always young, talented people. I mean, Adele I'm quite interested in. Yeah. I just quite fancied... I'm trying to think if there's anybody else. I think Drake is quite an interesting bloke. He's one of the younger generation sort of rapper. Yeah. As a character, I find him. You've got to fall in love sometimes with just the person. I fell in love with the whole Sinead O'Connor thing at one point. Yeah. I hadn't even heard a note she'd played. I just thought she's got cropped hair. She's had a terrible background. She's as beautiful as sin. I mean, she's sensational. And she's nervous and says stuff. And I thought, definitely want to work with her. Yeah. I hadn't heard anything she'd done. Well, at that point when I saw her. Yeah. Subsequently, she really ended up with only a few things, and she still gets into terrible trouble, and she's a very troubled soul. Yeah. But one's inclined to find these characters in music and find them very attractive. Yeah,
I mean, you were talking about the Gallagher brothers. You could see the tensions within, because they live in bubbles, really, don't they? These guys. And that must be difficult in itself, because they need to exclude people, but they also need people to bring in order to further their careers, I guess. Did you? The other thing I wanted to ask you was, did you have any disasters early on that you went to a gig and you got nothing?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
all got thrown out. Yeah, absolutely. Probably quite a lot, really. And certainly when I first started using flashes and things like that, I didn't know what I was doing. Even a couple I showed tonight were very poor quality, really. The first studio shoot I did, I hadn't synced up the flash with the camera.
Oh, God, yeah,
shooting it. You know, you had to shoot it at 60th or under or something, didn't you? 125
that's
maybe.
Right, yeah.
And I must have been shooting it, and
125
nothing
at a
came
push,
out.
really.
Yeah. No, I had a lot of disasters. I put the fix in before the dev, retriculation, the thermometer not working properly, the assistant not replenishing something, and so on and so on and so on and so on.
Yeah, how long has Rockarchive been going now?
Since 1998.
Right, okay. So that's a lot of stuff then, yeah?
Yeah, no, I'm very proud of the fact that it exists, actually, that it still exists. I was talking to David Hearn because it was inspired by Magnum. Yeah. But I've had, unlike Magnum, which is, the responsibility was spread, I've had all the responsibility. Yes. So it's been a heavy burden, actually. But the idea was to have an archive of archives so that the cultural history of rock and roll would be there to be found and seen. Yeah. And I've also banged on a great deal about the fact that we do not have a rock and roll repository, for want of a better word, a museum in the UK. Yeah. And both attempts to do it have been utter disasters, and nobody bothered to ask me what they should do, which they should do. Yeah. And so actually, I said to David, your archive, what's going to happen? Well, it'll go into Magnum, it'll be a foundation. What about my archive? Yes. What about Nick Rock's archive? And what about Penny Smith's archive? And so, of course, a lot of these archives will leave the country. They'll be sold privately. They'll be bought. And there is nothing... I mean, OK, you can probably ask the National Portrait Gallery to take it, but they've got all their other stuff. And similarly... Do
you exhibit at all? You exhibit as well?
We exhibit all the time. We only do printing, you see. We make prints. So we've got a Bowie exhibition on at the moment in Brixton with Photofusion, which is an educational institute, actually, in Brixton. We do stuff with the Teenage Cancer Trust in the Albert Hall. We've curated a 50 years of British rock and roll for the British Council. I've just done a punk exhibition called Chunk of Punk in the Barbican. I'm doing an Oasis exhibition in the Manchester Library. Wow! So we can individually and as a collective. Yeah. And I think that's why I'm saying actually we should really be lottery funded. Actually. Yeah. And the mistake is that we try to make it profitable, which it's never been. Actually, we've succeeded in it not being profitable, but really, it should have been a lottery funded, public owned or public interest situation, and that's the problem now. Is there's not much of that sort of thinking. Yeah,
it's a great shame, really, because you have in America Hall of Fame, etc., and they look after their archives. I remember going to the Library of Congress, and they keep all the stuff. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Well, it could be that all our archives will end up in America. And that is why I started Rockarchive. Right. They could all end up in America because there's nowhere to put it here. Right. There is nowhere to put it. And it's no good saying, OK, we'll put it in Sheffield, which they tried to do, because in Sheffield, I think they spent millions on a building and had no money left to put anything in it. And nobody wanted to go to Sheffield anyway. It's got to be in London or maybe Manchester. I don't know. Yeah. Where it is important, I think. It should probably be in London. Yeah. And it should, they've got a museum of punk in Washington when there was no punk in Washington as far as I know. So we haven't got any. We had the British Music Experience, which was up the back of the O2, 3 flights up, and with lots of toys for boys, push buttons and go on the internet, and then you'll get a card, and then, just no dignity whatsoever given to the subject.
No.
What has happened, though, is with the Bowie exhibition at the V&A, the Floyd exhibition coming up at the V&A, and Saatchi exhibition at the Rolling Stones, is that people are going, blimey, queues around the block, having to open extra hours, people flying in from other countries. Oh, quite. And even with the punk thing, it was 40 years of punk, and Boris Johnson, or whoever it was, agreed to put 100 grand, which is not very much. None of it came to Rockarchive, none. And I work with a Barbican librarian who's a vinyl junkie, and between us we put probably the best exhibition together of punk, just ourselves, with my funding and his record collection. Right. That has travelled round a bit, and I'm a bit fed up with it, really. But Rockarchive, the new website for Rockarchive, will be a little bit more to emphasise this historic side, because actually it's a historic cultural resource. Yeah. You interviewing photographers, we do it too. Yeah. And we've lost a few. We've lost the Beatles photographer Terry Spencer. We've lost the Elvis photographer Al Wertheim. And luckily I spoke to them. And but I can't do it on my own. And I'm not looking at my own archive while I'm looking at other people's work all the time.
Maybe Dylan will back you.
Maybe he will, actually.
Yeah.
It's not a bad idea, actually. He'd probably be more likely to do that than sit for a picture for me. Bastard.